The Supreme Court has just released a potential landmark decision impacting the future of birthright citizenship in the U.S. The justices were asked to roll back nationwide injunctions against the president's attempt to redefine the 14th Amendment, which states that anyone born in the U.S. is automatically a U.S. citizen, regardless of their parents' citizenship status. It's been in place for more than 150 years. Our Devin Dwyer, ABC senior Washington reporter who's been following the Supreme Court on this. Devin, it's not as straightforward as I think a lot of people were perhaps expecting or hoping to hear. So break down what this actually means.
Well, this was a big surprise, Whit, and this is coming from the youngest conservative justice on the Supreme Court, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, 6-3, as you said, in a big win for Donald Trump, saying he can move forward with that executive order that he issued on day one.
Okay, so the Supreme Court just dealt Trump the most devastating blow of his entire presidency. And I'm talking about a ruling that doesn't just affect one policy or one case. It fundamentally strips away Trump's ability to govern the way he's been governing. On October 28, 2025, the Supreme Court issued a landmark decision that says Trump cannot use executive power unilaterally for major policy decisions, that he needs congressional authorization, and that decades of expanding presidential power end right here, right now. In the reaction, absolute chaos, panic, and turmoil throughout the entire Trump administration. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join, and if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what's happening. The Supreme Court didn't just slap Trump's wrist or tell him to be more careful. They systematically dismantled his entire approach to the presidency. The court ruled that sweeping emergency declarations, global tariffs, immigration orders, mass federal firings, all of it requires congressional authorization or is outright unconstitutional. Trump can't just issue executive orders on major policy and expect them to stick anymore. The court has forced him back into the constitutional framework where Congress makes laws and the president executes them, not the other way around. Can you believe this? The court used unusually direct language to warn Trump that executive emergency powers have constitutional limits. They didn't dance around it with legal jargon. They directly told Trump, you've gone too far. You've exceeded your authority, and we're putting a stop to it right now. For the first time in modern history, the Supreme Court has explicitly barred a president from using emergency declarations and executive orders to avoid congressional scrutiny. That's unprecedented. That's historic, and that's absolutely devastating for Trump's ability to govern. The ruling states clearly that major decisions with far-reaching political or economic impact must be authorized by Congress. That means Trump can't set tariffs unilaterally anymore. He can't fire agency heads at will. He can't override immigration statutes without new laws.
Let's connect now with CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes, who is following all of this for us from West Palm Beach this morning. Nancy, part of the executive order Trump signed says agencies must follow how the president and attorney general interpret the law. Help us understand what that means.
What it means, Errol, is that often various government agencies and departments, as laws come in, they will interpret those laws and incorporate them into their programs and policies. And what this executive order is now saying is that actually no.
Everything Trump's been doing through executive action for the past few years, the court just said all of that requires congressional approval. And if Congress won't give approval, Trump can't do it, period. Think about what this means for Trump's agenda. His entire governance strategy has been built on maximizing executive power and minimizing congressional involvement. He couldn't get legislation through Congress, so he governed through executive orders and emergency declarations. But the Supreme Court just told him that strategy is unconstitutional. Trump now has to work with Congress to accomplish anything significant. And given his terrible relationship with Congress, that means his policy agenda is essentially dead. The immediate fallout has been absolutely chaotic. Trump's allies went into panic mode the moment the decision came down. Staff leaks describe dramatic late-night strategy sessions where nobody can figure out what to do next. There are reports of resignations from officials who realize the administration can't function under these new constraints. There's total confusion over what the White House can and cannot do legally. Political strategists are calling this unprecedented in modern presidential history. Come on, you know what late-night strategy sessions and mass confusion mean? Trump's team has no plan for governing within constitutional limits because they never expected to have to. They built their entire operation around presidential unilateralism, and the Supreme Court just pulled the rug out from under them. Now they're scrambling to figure out how to actually work with Congress, how to operate within the separation of powers, and most of them have no idea how to do that. GOP leaders held emergency meetings trying to figure out how to respond. Do they defend Trump against the Supreme Court and risk looking like they don't respect the rule of law? Do they support the court's decision and risk Trump's wrath? Do they try to find some middle ground that doesn't exist? Republican lawmakers are caught in an impossible position, and the emergency meetings showed just how panicked they are about the political implications. The Supreme Court emphasized that it's restoring separation of powers and democratic accountability. That language is significant because it means the court sees Trump's approach to the presidency as fundamentally threatening to constitutional government. They're not just correcting one overreach, they're resetting the entire balance of power between branches. And they're explicitly saying that Congress must reassert its constitutional role in major policy decisions. The ruling has emboldened lower courts and lawmakers to reject or overturn future executive overreaches. Federal judges who were on the fence about blocking Trump's orders now have clear Supreme Court guidance saying that major unilateral actions are unconstitutional. Congressional committees that were hesitant to push back against executive power now have the Supreme Court backing them up. Trump's facing a coordinated institutional response from all branches of government, saying enough is enough. Are you kidding me? The Supreme Court just told every other part of government it's okay to check presidential power. We support you. We'll back you up. That's a game changer for Trump because he can no longer bully or intimidate other institutions into accepting his overreach. The court has given everyone permission and encouragement to push back, and that's exactly what's happening. Seasoned advisors inside the administration are describing the situation as total legal and political chaos. These are experienced people who've worked in multiple administrations, and they're saying they've never seen anything like this. The combination of legal constraints, political pressure, and internal confusion has created a situation where the executive branch essentially doesn't know how to function anymore under Trump's leadership. The decision closes the door on decades of expanding unitary presidency claims. Both Democratic and Republican presidents have been pushing the boundaries of executive power for years, claiming more and more authority to act unilaterally. But the Supreme Court just said that trend ends now. They've drawn clear lines that future presidents cannot cross, and Trump happened to be the president in office when the court decided to finally enforce those limits. This caps off months of mounting legal peril for Trump. He's been facing criminal prosecution, civil lawsuits, congressional investigations, and now the Supreme Court has stripped away his primary tool for avoiding accountability, which was governing through executive action that bypassed normal checks and balances. Trump's legal and political situation has never been worse, and this Supreme Court ruling just made it exponentially worse. So buckle up, because we're going to break down exactly what the Supreme Court struck down, why this ruling is so devastating for Trump, and what it means for the future of presidential power in America. This is a constitutional reset happening in real time, and we're watching the most powerful presidency in modern history get cut down to constitutional size. Let's get into it. All right, so let's dig into what the Supreme Court actually did, because the specifics of this ruling show just how comprehensively they've dismantled Trump's governing strategy. The court didn't issue a narrow ruling on one policy. They issued a broad decision that affects virtually every major action Trump has taken through executive power. And the reasoning behind the decision is even more significant than the immediate practical effects. The emergency declarations issue is huge. Trump has used emergency declarations to justify all sorts of unilateral actions, from immigration restrictions to tariff policies to federal spending. He declared an emergency and then claimed that gave him special powers to bypass Congress. But the Supreme Court just said that's not how emergency powers work. Emergency declarations have constitutional limits, and those limits prevent presidents from using emergencies as a general purpose tool to avoid working with Congress on controversial policies. The court's reasoning is particularly damning for Trump. They pointed out that Trump has declared emergencies for situations that aren't actually emergencies in any traditional sense. Immigration at the southern border has been an ongoing issue for decades. That's not a sudden emergency requiring immediate presidential action. Trade disputes with China are policy disagreements, not emergencies. The court essentially called out Trump for abusing emergency powers to get around the constitutional requirement that major policies need congressional approval. Can you believe this? The Supreme Court looked at Trump's emergency declarations and said, these aren't real emergencies. This is just you trying to avoid having to convince Congress to support your policies. That's a brutal assessment from the highest court in the land, and it means Trump can't use that tactic anymore. No more fake emergencies to justify executive overreach. The tariff issue is particularly significant economically. Trump has imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods from various countries, claiming he has inherent authority to set trade policy. But the Supreme Court just said that major tariff decisions with far-reaching economic impacts require congressional authorization. Trump can't just wake up one morning and decide to impose massive tariffs that affect entire industries and millions of jobs. That's a major policy decision that Congress needs to approve. This strips away one of Trump's favorite economic tools. He's used tariff threats and actual tariffs as bargaining chips in negotiations with other countries. He's imposed tariffs to protect industries he favors. He's threatened tariffs to punish political opponents. All of that is now unconstitutional, according to the Supreme Court. If Trump wants to impose major new tariffs, he needs to go to Congress and get legislation passed, which is a much higher bar than just issuing an executive order. The immigration orders are another huge part of this ruling. Trump has issued numerous executive orders on immigration, from travel bans to asylum restrictions to border enforcement policies. The Supreme Court has now said that when these orders override existing immigration statutes or make major changes to immigration policy, they require congressional authorization. Trump can't just rewrite immigration law through executive orders, even if he frames them as enforcement actions. Come on, think about what this means. Immigration has been Trump's signature issue, his rallying cry, his main policy focus, and the Supreme Court just told him he can't implement major immigration changes without Congress. That's devastating for Trump's ability to deliver on his core campaign promises. He needs congressional cooperation, which he doesn't have, which means his immigration agenda is essentially paralyzed. The mass federal firings issue strikes at Trump's efforts to control the federal bureaucracy. Trump has been trying to make it easier to fire federal employees and replace them with political loyalists. He's issued executive orders attempting to reclassify thousands of positions to make them easier to fire. But the Supreme Court has now ruled that major changes to civil service protections require congressional authorization. Trump can't just restructure the entire federal workforce through executive orders. This is huge because it protects the independence of federal agencies. Trump wants agencies full of loyalists who will do whatever he says without question. But the Supreme Court has preserved civil service protections that ensure federal employees can't be fired simply for political reasons. This maintains some institutional independence and prevents Trump from turning the entire executive branch into his personal political operation. The Supreme Court's emphasis on restoring separation of powers is the most significant aspect of this ruling. The court is explicitly saying that the balance of power between branches has gotten out of whack, with presidents claiming too much authority and Congress ceding too much power. This ruling is designed to reset that balance, to force presidents to work with Congress, and to restore the system of checks and balances that the founders envisioned. The court cited historical examples of how the separation of powers is supposed to work. They pointed out that major policy decisions have traditionally required congressional action. It noted that the founders specifically gave Congress the power to make laws because they wanted major decisions to go through a deliberative body that represents the people, not through unilateral executive action. The court is going back to first principles and saying this is how American government is supposed to work. Are you kidding me? The Supreme Court just gave us a civics lesson about why separation of powers matters and why Trump's approach to the presidency violates fundamental constitutional principles. This isn't just a legal ruling, it's an institutional rebuke of Trump's entire governing philosophy. The impact on lower courts is already being felt. Federal judges who are unsure whether to block Trump's executive orders now have clear guidance from the Supreme Court saying they should block orders that aren't authorized by Congress. We're seeing a wave of preliminary injunctions and temporary restraining orders against Trump policies as judges apply the Supreme Court's reasoning to pending cases. Trump's facing legal challenges on every front, and he's losing most of them because the Supreme Court has made clear that his unilateral actions are unconstitutional. The congressional response has been swift and significant. Lawmakers from both parties are using the Supreme Court decision to reassert congressional authority. Committees are holding hearings on executive overreach. Legislation is being introduced to codify the limits the court has imposed. Even some Republicans who usually defend Trump are saying that the court got this one right and Congress needs to reclaim its constitutional role. The political strategists calling this unprecedented aren't exaggerating. We haven't seen a Supreme Court decision this consequential for presidential power since the steel seizure case in 1952, when the court told President Truman he couldn't seize steel mills even during the Korean War. This ruling is in that tradition, a decisive check on executive power during a moment of claimed crisis. And like that ruling, this one is going to shape how presidents operate for decades to come. The staff leaks about late-night strategy sessions are particularly revealing. Normally, White House staff maintain discipline and don't leak details of internal deliberations. But the chaos is so intense that people are leaking to the press out of frustration and confusion. They're describing a White House that has no idea how to function under the new constraints the court has imposed. Strategy sessions that used to focus on policy are now consumed by legal discussions about what's even allowed anymore. Come on, think about what it means when your own staff is leaking about how dysfunctional things are. These are people who work for Trump, who presumably want him to succeed, and they're so frustrated by the chaos that they're talking to reporters about internal meltdowns. That tells you the situation inside the White House is even worse than it appears from the outside. The resignations are also significant. When officials resign in protest or frustration, it's usually over policy disagreements. But these resignations are about people concluding that the administration simply can't function anymore given the legal constraints. They're not leaving because they disagree with Trump's goals. They're leaving because they don't think those goals can be achieved within the constitutional limits the Supreme Court has imposed. The legal exposure created by this ruling is enormous. Every executive order Trump issued that the court says required congressional authorization is now legally vulnerable. Lawsuits that were dismissed because courts thought Trump had authority to act are being reopened, with plaintiffs arguing that the Supreme Court has now ruled Trump lacked that authority. Trump's facing potentially dozens of new legal challenges based on this decision, and he's likely to lose most of them. The political implications extend far beyond Trump. This ruling affects how every future president will approach executive power. Democratic presidents who wanted to use executive orders to bypass a Republican Congress now know the Supreme Court will strike those down. Republican presidents who wanted to use emergency powers for their priorities now know there are enforceable limits. This is a bipartisan limitation on executive power that will affect American government for generations. Okay, so let's break down what happens next, because this Supreme Court ruling has created a new political and legal reality that Trump has to navigate. The question isn't whether Trump accepts the ruling. He has no choice about that. The question is whether he can adapt his governing strategy to work within constitutional limits. And based on everything we know about Trump, that seems highly unlikely. First, the immediate practical impact on Trump's agenda. Virtually every major policy Trump wants to implement now requires congressional approval. Want to impose new tariffs? Need a bill. Want to restrict immigration? Need a bill. Want to reorganize federal agencies? Need a bill. Trump's going to have to work with Congress, negotiate compromises, accept limitations on his goals, and given Trump's track record of terrible relationships with Congress, including with members of his own party, this is a nearly impossible task. The congressional dynamics are particularly challenging for Trump. Republicans have narrow control of Congress, which means Trump needs near unanimous Republican support plus some Democratic votes to pass controversial legislation. But Republicans are fractured between MAGA hardliners and moderates, and Democrats have no incentive to help Trump accomplish his goals. So even simple legislation is going to be incredibly difficult to pass, and major policy changes are probably impossible. Can you believe Trump's entire agenda is now dependent on his ability to work with Congress? The man who governs through executive orders, who circumvents Congress whenever possible, who attacks lawmakers who don't give him what he wants, now has to actually negotiate and compromise to accomplish anything. That's like asking a fish to climb a tree. It's fundamentally contrary to Trump's nature and approach. The budget implications are also significant. The Supreme Court ruling affects how Trump can spend federal money. He can't just redirect funds from one program to another without congressional authorization. He can't declare emergencies to access funds Congress didn't appropriate for his priorities. He actually has to work through the normal budget process, which means negotiating with appropriators, accepting committee oversight, and compromising on his spending priorities. Trump's shown no ability or willingness to work within the normal budget process. He's tried to bypass it through emergency declarations, through creative interpretations of existing authorities, through pressure on agency heads to redirect funds, but the Supreme Court has shut down all those workarounds. Trump either works through the proper channels or he doesn't get funding, and working through proper channels requires skills and temperament Trump doesn't have. Come on, think about Trump trying to negotiate budget compromises with congressional appropriators. That requires patience, attention to detail, willingness to give ground on some issues to gain ground on others. Those aren't Trump's strengths. Trump wants total victories, wants to bully people into submission, wants to act unilaterally. The budget process doesn't work that way, and Trump's going to struggle immensely with it. The foreign policy implications are also huge. Trump's used executive power extensively in foreign policy, from trade negotiations to military deployments to diplomatic recognition decisions. The Supreme Court ruling doesn't affect all foreign policy. Presidents still have significant constitutional authority in that area, but the ruling does affect major foreign policy decisions with significant domestic impact, like imposing tariffs or restricting immigration or deploying military forces domestically. Trump's going to have to be much more careful about how he exercises foreign policy power. He can't use foreign policy as a backdoor way to implement domestic policies that Congress won't approve. He can't impose trade restrictions that are really about domestic political goals rather than genuine foreign policy concerns. The Supreme Court will be watching, and so will lower courts, ready to strike down executive actions that exceed constitutional bounds. The impact on Trump's legal defenses in other cases is significant. Trump's been arguing in various lawsuits that he has broad executive authority to take controversial actions, but the Supreme Court just definitively rejected that argument. Trump's legal team can't claim broad executive authority anymore because the court has clearly limited it. That undermines Trump's defenses in dozens of pending cases and could lead to unfavorable rulings across the board. Are you kidding me? Trump's entire legal strategy in multiple cases was based on claiming expansive executive power, and the Supreme Court just told every judge in America that those claims are wrong. Trump's lawyers are going to have to completely rethink their approach, and in many cases, they're not going to have any good alternative arguments. Let's talk about the 2026 midterm implications. Republican candidates are going to have to answer for the Supreme Court's rebuke of Trump. Voters are going to ask whether they support a president who the Supreme Court says violated constitutional limits on executive power. Do Republicans defend Trump against the court and risk looking like they don't respect the Constitution? Or do they acknowledge the court was right and risk Trump's wrath and that of his base? The political ads practically write themselves. Democrats will run footage of the Supreme Court ruling, quotes from the decision, and ask voters whether they want to support Republicans who enabled a president who exceeded constitutional authority. Those ads are going to be effective in suburban districts with educated voters who care about constitutional governance. Republicans could lose significant numbers of seats because of this Supreme Court decision. The impact on Trump's 2028 prospects, if he could even run again, is also significant. Trump's facing a situation where he's been rebuked by the Supreme Court for violating constitutional limits, where his own staff describes total chaos, where his governing strategy has been ruled unconstitutional. That's not a record you run on. That's not something you brag about on the campaign trail. Trump's presidency is going to be defined by this Supreme Court decision, and it's not a favorable definition. The institutional precedent this sets is the most important long-term impact. The Supreme Court has drawn clear lines about executive power that will constrain not just Trump, but all future presidents. Those limits will shape American government for decades. Presidents who want to accomplish major goals will have to work with Congress. Presidents who try to act unilaterally on major issues will face court challenges they'll probably lose. The era of expanding presidential power has ended, replaced by a new era of enforced limits. Come on, think about what this means for American democracy. For years, scholars have warned about the rise of the imperial presidency, about presidents accumulating too much power, and Congress becoming irrelevant. This Supreme Court decision is a decisive reversal of that trend. The court has forced power back to Congress, has restored the separation of powers, has reaffirmed that major decisions require democratic deliberation and approval, not unilateral executive action. The chaos in Trump's inner circle is going to continue and probably intensify. Staff who thought they were empowered to implement Trump's agenda are now realizing they don't have the authority they thought they had. Agencies that were planning major policy changes are now being told those changes require congressional approval they're unlikely to get. Advisors who built strategies around executive unilateralism are going back to the drawing board with no clear alternative approach. The GOP emergency meetings show the parties in crisis over this. Republican lawmakers know the Supreme Court decision is popular with swing voters who care about constitutional governance. But they also know Trump and his base are going to be furious about limitations on executive power. There's no position that satisfies both constituencies, which means Republicans are going to continue fracturing between pro-Trump and pro-Constitution factions. So where does this leave us? The Supreme Court has fundamentally altered the balance of power in American government. Trump's agenda is paralyzed because he can't govern unilaterally anymore. His staff is in chaos, trying to figure out how to function within constitutional limits. His political position is weakened because the court has declared his approach unconstitutional, and the precedent set by this decision will constrain presidential power for generations. Stay tuned, because we're going to see whether Trump can adapt to governing within constitutional limits, or whether his presidency simply becomes non-functional. We're going to see whether Congress can reassert its authority, or whether institutional paralysis results from these new constraints. We're going to see whether American democracy can be restored to proper constitutional balance, or whether the chaos continues. This Supreme Court decision is a defining moment, a reset of governmental power, and the consequences are going to shape American politics for decades to come. Trump's executive power has been stripped, turmoil has erupted, and the entire structure of presidential authority has been fundamentally altered in ways we're only beginning to understand.